Let's speak about how evil Keir Starmer is, because he is evil. He is no good, darn tootin', stinking, rotten human being, that Keir Starmer.
What a sentence.
Yeah, and all it takes is a cursory look into his backstory, into his history, and it's very, very easy to find that this man, I don't think, has contributed a single positive to the human experience in his 60-odd years of life on this planet. And I'll be able to back that up with statements because, interestingly enough, back at the end of June or the beginning of July, I think, the Times newspaper did a 3-part series looking at the history of Keir Starmer that's quite in-depth and detailed, that says everything that it needs to. No, he was never just a boring Blairite bureaucrat, even though he presented himself as one, and even though I'm pretty certain he has no inner monologue. But
he doesn't dream, he doesn't have thoughts.
He doesn't read books.
He just executes legislation like an android. I mean, he makes Hal in 2001 A Space Odyssey look far more human than him. Or the android from Alien as well. Yeah,
well, at least in Hal, in 2001, Hal sings a little nursery rhyme at the end. And it's quite sad, even though he's an evil android that's evil AI that's gone off, that's gone crazy. I don't think Keir Starmer knows any nursery rhymes.
He doesn't know music.
He doesn't conceive of it. It's a series of ones and zeros for old Keir. But first, we've got a new YouTube channel called Lotus Eaters Daily that you should check out. It's not got any videos on it yet, but by the time that this video comes out on YouTube, it should have 1 or 2. It's not going to be replacing the daily podcast. It is going to be alongside the daily podcast. This is going to be more focused, shorter videos where one at a time we look at some articles or videos, talk about them, and it should be a little bit more fun as well.
It's more stuff for you freeloaders, so sign up to our website. So
No, that's right. Do the shaming tactics. It's always worked for me. Do it. Tell them how poor they are.
To prove you're not poor, sign up to our website so I can stop being poor and living in my Swindon hovel. But also, if you have signed up to our website, you're a very nice person, and thank you very much, and we love you.
Yes, cheers. Josh loves you, and he will be willing to do anything to prove that.
That is true.
And I do mean anything.
Anything.
All right, so here's... Keir Starmer jump scare.
Oh my goodness.
Sorry to do that to you all. So here's the first part of this 3-part series. I won't be going over all 3 parts. I'll be taking bits and pieces from the first 2 and then looking at a little bit of extra documentation regarding Keir Starmer's case history, mainly because let's remember, for most of his career, Keir Starmer, before he became Director of Public Prosecutions in 2008, was a human rights lawyer. And he is...
Boo.
Exactly the kind that we in this country have hated for a very, very long time. Because what is it, as a human rights lawyer, that he specialised in?
Rapists and murderers. And terrorists.
Pretty close, yes. Defending murderers and terrorists and making sure that they either A, do not get the chop on death row, or B, do not get deported. And also, as a little added bonus, that if they had control orders under Tony Blair's government, if they were a terrorist suspect, that they did not have to abide by the control orders, which would have meant that their movement was restricted for 18 hours per day, and instead had free movement across the country. Because when someone's suspected of terrorism, that's what you want. You want them to be able to move freely through the country, through your communities. Thank you, Keir, for your work in human rights. That's right, the human right for terrorists to be in your communities.
Because everyone knows the most oppressed group in Britain are terrorists. And so they need help.
Persecuted everywhere they go.
I know, yeah. Everyone's so hostile to them. It's just bigotry. It's anti-terrorist bigotry.
Makes you wonder why. So anyway, in this first one, it takes up to the year about 2000. So let's go through some of the more notable things that it mentions in here. So it goes back to his time in university. Oxford, where he had been a member of the editorial collective for a Marxist journal, Socialist Alternatives, affiliated with an obscure Greek Trotskyist, Michalis Raptis, sorry. It had, and yes, that is an anagram.
Look at that young Starmer thing. That looks like the lamest electro band.
It's like a new wave band.
It is, yeah.
But one of the really bad ones that came off the coattails of New Order.
Yeah.
You get New Order, and then you get whatever this is.
Mm-hmm.
It has a focus on green issues, women rights, and gay equality. He was radical as a barrister, certainly, which in the 80s was still a very conservative profession, said Gavin Miller, KC, a colleague throughout his legal career. We were doing what was called civil liberties work during the bar, during the Thatcher years, when it was very, very difficult. It wasn't terribly well paid. It was all legal aid, or at best, a trade union would fund you, or an NGO. Thank you, NGOs. And thank you, Thatcher, for helping to expand the NGO network so they could fund your ideological enemies. That was one of Thatcher's big things, was she opened up the political market for all of the people who hated her. So good job there. He developed a strong academic interest in criminology and penology. Why do people offend? How do we deal with them? How do we prosecute them and punish them? And how to rehabilitate them?
How do you rehabilitate a terrorist?
That's the question, isn't it? Keir Starmer wanted to put his mind to that. But that's a very difficult and interesting area of the law, and it's a really sharp area of the law as far as human rights are concerned. That was his first love. He was very interested in the rights of criminal suspects and prisoners. That's in this article. So there you go. Straight away, from the beginning, he was always on their side, not your side. He always looked at the criminal as someone being persecuted by society rather than as somebody being justly punished for victimizing other people.
It is worth pointing out as well, he was the editor of a Marxist publication, and the Marxists in Russia, one of the first things they did was release all of the criminals.
And what was it that Keir Starmer did within his first few weeks of office, of being Prime Minister?
It's funny that, isn't it? It's almost like there are parallels. It's almost like he's behaving like an actual historic communist.
I mean, to be fair, this is easily the closest this country's ever come to an actual Stalinist government.
It is, actually, and that's not even being hyperbolic. I mean, we're not quite at the level of tax rates of the 1960s yet, but we're getting there slowly, aren't we?
Yes, and certainly the overuse of political power to punish your enemies, it might not be as brutal and straightforward as Stalin just sending people to come and shoot you, but he still has sent the police to go and actively persecute his enemies. He sent the police to arrest people on the street. Now he's persecuting the kulaks. It all fits.
Just the other day, a soldier got 2 years in prison for basically posting stuff that we talk about all the time about Islam. It was pretty tepid stuff, actually. And there was a case of an actual paedophile who didn't get any prison time.
Because that's what this country does. It gives suspended sentences to paedophiles and patriots who are annoyed at the fact that foreigners can come into their country and murder children. They get 2 years. The young Starmer joined and later became secretary of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. Starmer proclaimed his idealistic views in the society's magazine, Socialist Lawyer. He and a co-author argued for trade unions to aspire to socialist self-management and declared that collective bargaining was insufficient because it failed to involve ownership of the means of production. He wrote in 1995, saying that we could do worse than to begin by dismantling those common law rules governing the property entitlements of private parties, which for almost 1,000 years judges have been happy to regard as pre-political norms. Dismantle private property. And 1,000 years of judges recognising it as pre-political norms because that was simply British tradition. You, as an Englishman, as a Brit, had the right of property.
But private property is so ingrained into human beings that even non-human primates understand the concept of private property to a certain extent.
But again, people have said, since these articles have come out, since people have looked into his background, they've said, this was young Starmer. This was what he thought then. He's learnt a lot since then and feels differently now. I disagree, because he seems to very much be behaving in the way that you would expect of somebody coming to power who wrote these kinds of things. Because what's the first thing he's doing? He's using laws and inheritance tax to subtly, not so subtly, force farmers into selling off their property. Selling off their land, which has been in their family for generations and generations, and people have been coming out using Marxist language like saying that they are hoarding that land.
Yeah, well, all he's done is rebranded himself. He's not really changed. I don't really believe that people can change in their adult life very much.
No, and it seems that a lot of the changes happened when he became Director of Public Prosecutions, which more than anything seems like a pragmatic change of the way he presented himself, more than anything to do with his actual beliefs. Yeah,
I agree. Yeah.
He changed how he behaved a little bit purely for pragmatic reasons. He didn't change what he believed.
That doesn't make it better in many ways, that makes it worse.
Well, yeah, it's dishonest. When Starmer was interviewed as an earnest young man for tenancy at Chambers, he said that prison did not work. For who? I mean, it doesn't work for the criminals. It doesn't help. It doesn't work, I suppose, if you want to rehabilitate them, but I don't think that prison should be for rehabilitation. I think it should be to make sure that violent criminals are not on the streets.
I mean, if you have a situation where there is a justice system and a prison system versus a complete absence of punishment, I think we know which one will have more crime.
Certainly. Well, we can go to a case study of that in just a moment. But first, Starmer had been called to the bar in 1987, and until 1990, Liberty employed him as a legal officer. And it's important to point out that in the late 1970s, Liberty was a political action group formerly known as the NCCL, that most notoriously... Oh, God, excuse me, I'm so sorry. This really has taken effect. That notoriously worked with Pi, which, for those who don't know, Pi was the British paedophile information exchange. And one of their founding members sat on the NCCL's Gay Rights Commission. Keir Starmer chose to work for them in the 1990s, from the 87 till 1990, so that's very interesting. The idealistic Starmer worked pro bono, for free, for the Death Penalty Project, a charity run out of the law firm Simons Muirhead Burton that receives funding from the Foreign Office, European Union, and charitable foundations and fights the death penalty around the world. Again, he's fighting for the criminals, not the victims.
Yeah, the death penalty, by the way, I think is one of the most just punishments for certain crimes, in that...
Like murder.
Yeah, if a murderer gets imprisoned, for example, then the victim's family has to pay for the incarceration, the housing and upkeep of the person that killed their beloved family member. How is that justice? I don't think it is at all.
It certainly isn't, but let's see how Starmer dealt with this injustice. Well, one of his earliest death penalty cases involved two men convicted of murder, Earl Pratt and Ivan Morgan, who had spent 14 years on death row in Jamaica. They were set to be executed, but given 3 last-minute reprieves. Starmer argued that the mental torment during the prisoner's long time awaiting execution was inhumane and therefore violated Jamaica's constitution. In 1993, the Privy Council agreed, ruling that a delay of more than 5 years in carrying out a death sentence was cruel and inhumane and therefore unconstitutional.
Well, I mean, I'm all in favour of speeding up the process.
Yeah.
I mean, once they've been found guilty, particularly if, it's incontrovertible, evidence that they've murdered someone, why not do it, from judge to gallows like that? Why mess around in the middle?
Easy, but that was the case that he supposedly made his name on. And in December 2000, Starmer was named the Liberty and Justice Human Rights Lawyer of the Year, a noble achievement. Judges singled out his work representing murderers facing execution, as well as training their lawyers in the Caribbean. So not only did he prevent murderers from reaching the gallows, he then helped to train other lawyers to do the same thing.
You know what they say about lawyers and how...
They say many things about
actually
lawyers.
I'm in this profession, I'm likely to get sued at some point, so lawyers, you're good, but otherwise you know what I was going to say.
Yeah, Starmer has said of his fight against executions he had become frustrated that we were only going about them case by case when what was needed was wider change. So then I got into a strategic litigation, he told the alumni magazine for the University of Leeds. Can we pick cases that will change the whole law for an entire class of people? That class being murderers.
The criminal class?
Yes. He decided, this is me editorializing now, that murderers needed better treatment. And this was not something that he did out of necessity, like many of the other cases we'll see. They'll try and say that, he only defended this or that terrorist because of cab rules, which means that if you have the time free in your diary and it's your specialist specialist area of expertise as a lawyer, you have to take the case on. This was something that he felt out of an ideological obligation to pursue justice as he saw it, which was making sure that on a worldwide, global scale, the death penalty for murderers was wrong.
Boo.
Okay. Starmer and Fitzgerald were instrumental in looking at how we might try to change the law or get countries to develop their systems. Hundreds were previously on death row in the West Indies. Now the punishment was all but gone, and in fact was, I think, abandoned in Jamaica. Now Jamaica, as the case study, has the highest murder rate in the world. Great job, Starmer. Great job. You've done wonders for Jamaica. Labour pledged to bring in a British Bill of Rights in its victorious 1997 general election manifesto, and Tony Blair's Human Rights Act was passed in 1998, which of course basically brought the ECHR into British legislation. It sanctified everything that was in the European human rights to Britain. In an article for The Independent in early 1999, Starmer wrote of hopes that the Act would create a human rights culture in the UK. Again, that just means goes easier on criminals. The start date had been delayed until 2000, so judges and tribunal members could be trained in human rights law, training that he helped to deliver. The idea of Doughty Street training magistrates and police is bizarre, said Starmer, but we are writing the manuals. That year, 2000, he wrote the guide to the Act, analysing the law in 1,500 Strasbourg cases that affected the UK. The textbook kind of took the legal world by storm, said Mackay. This was a book with academic and forensic rigour, but inherently pragmatic for this new wave of lawyers that would be working with the Human Rights Act. So he literally wrote the textbook. He wrote the textbook.
Not even in a figure of speech, the actual textbook. It's also worth mentioning as well, a quick caveat here. We're not against the notion of, actual human rights, but the way that they're being used is a cloak to advocate for criminals. We don't think that, the rights of criminals should trump the rights of their victims. I think that's fair to say.
No,
right?
Absolutely. Human rights as a basis for justice are fine and have a great tradition, both legal and moral, going back 1,000 years plus. Certainly in Britain. The way that it's been operated since at least the Blairite years, if not before, as we've seen in this article, is turned on its head. It used to be the human rights of the citizen, of the subject of the Crown of England. Now it seems to be the human rights of the criminal, who we used to just execute for basically willy-nilly reasons back in Britain a few hundred years ago. But now it's flipped so much the opposite way that we prioritise the human rights of the criminal who has victimised innocent people. That is how this country operates now.
I would argue that the death penalty is the bedrock of any good, noble civilization, because you can't have these people either being a burden economically or a burden in terms of killing people.
It has been argued that the liberal use of the death penalty in Britain and completely eliminating almost the entire bottom 1% criminal class of the country is one of the things that opened up freedoms for the rest of the people in this country to create the Industrial Revolution.
Being harsh on crime is the bedrock of having freedom, in my opinion. You need to kill criminals so that you can be free.
Certainly, I agree with that. But let's take a look at one of the Jamaican cases that he looked over that got the death penalty abolished. And this is back in 2004. UK limits Jamaica death sentence, the mandatory death penalty for murder in Jamaica. So this was if you murdered somebody, if you were convicted of murder in Jamaica, you got a mandatory death penalty. Seems perfectly fair to me.
Yep.
Was abolished on Wednesday, the 7th of July, 2004, clearly a dark, dark day for Jamaica. It was a historic judgment from 9 judges sitting in London. The appeal was on behalf of 4 death row prisoners, Charles Matthews from Trinidad, Lennox Boyce and Jeffrey Joseph from Barbados, and Jamaican Lambert Watson. 3 leading English QCs, Queen Counsels, Nicholas Blake, Edward Fitzgerald and Keir Starmer argued their cases free of charge. Another pro bono case. How very kind of him. Matthews was sentenced to death in 1999 for killing his former lover out of jealousy. Boyce and Joseph were jointly convicted in 2002 of the murder of Markel Hippolyte, 22 years old. And the same year, Watson received the death sentence for stabbing to death his 9-month-old daughter and her mother. And Keir Starmer decided free of charge these were the cases that these were the people he was going to defend.
Keir Starmer cares more about child murderers than the murdered child and her mother, or his mother.
Certainly that's what it appears to me. I'll try and speed through some of this now because I've got a little bit more to go through, but I'll try and get through it as quick as possible. So this is going into the second part of his career from the 2000 to about 2008 when he became Director of Public Prosecutions. So this is when, again, he was still a human rights lawyer. This is when he began to really make his name defending terrorists. The Labour government had painted itself into a corner because of its dedication to human rights. It knew that dangerous jihadists were active in Britain, some uncomfortably close to Osama bin Laden's movement, but if they came from countries where they were at risk of ill treatment, it would be a breach of their rights to deport them.
Oh, we hear about this daily now, don't we?
Yep. If evidence against terrorists came from confidential intelligence sources, suspects could not be prosecuted without endangering British spies and their informers, yet detention without trial would also breach suspects' human rights. As Labour Home Secretaries wrestled with how to protect the public from the growing jihadi threat, Keir Starmer, by then one of Britain's leading human rights lawyers, became a regular fixture in the law courts, seeking to persuade judges to free or relax restrictions on terrorist suspects. Starmer found holes in the Labour government's counter-terrorism legislation, causing headaches for ministers. In February 2007, his Doughty Street change, is that how you pronounce it, by the way?
What's that, sorry?
Doughty Street, is it, or is
I'm not
Doughty
familiar.
Street? I don't know. Made a public statement noting Starmer's third High Court victory in a row against the Home Secretary John Reid's control orders, a form of house arrest that curtailed the movement and activities of terrorist suspects. Lawyers point out that Starmer was obliged to accept the cases under the cab rank rule that barristers must accept briefs if they are asked and have space in their diaries. One former senior Whitehall figure quipped that if Starmer was in a cab rank, it was the one outside Finsbury Park Mosque.
There is something worth mentioning here that could have disincentivised lots of terror attacks, is that what you can do to disincentivise terrorists, but is a human rights violation, is you bury their remains at sea, which means you don't go to heaven in Islam. There are lots of other things, you can soak your bullets in pig's blood, for example, which is definitely against, all sorts of weird human rights conventions and things like that. There are lots of ways in which Muslim terrorists believe that they will not go to heaven and be rewarded for their actions that we have not taken because of human rights lawyers. I would argue that these human rights lawyers are complicit in the murder of innocent people by defending them.
Well, certainly, and people have pointed out, well, he's done the cab rank rules. The thing is, as well, in this article, that they go to some opposing opinions to that, saying, well, they came to Keir Starmer because he became the go-to guy. He became the go-to guy for terrorist suspects.
So Osama's top guy.
Osama's top guy. He's kind of like Better Call Saul, but for terrorists.
It's not a reputation you want, is it?
So
great series, though.
Yeah, in February this year, Starmer's office claimed credit for the Labour leader having overseen the deportation of countless terrorists when he was Director of Public Prosecutions from 2008 to 2013, basically when he decided he needed a bit of a public image change before his career in politics. Before that era, because, in fact, it says in here that Ed Miliband in 2008 was already introducing him to other people in the Labour Party, saying that he's probably going to start a career in politics soon. So clearly this was all very intentional from him, thinking to himself, I'm going to need to get a better reputation before I go into politics or people aren't going to vote for me. Before that era, though, terrorism suspects facing deportation were among his clients. A suspect known as Y, a close associate of Abu Hamza, ran the bookshop at Finsbury Park Mosque in London and made copies of recipes for explosives and toxins. Y was cleared at the Old Bailey of an alleged Al-Qaeda ricin plot to poison the public, but was ordered to be deported as a danger to British security. In his native Algeria, he was under a death sentence for organising an armed group. So the kind of guy you want desperately to stay in your country,
It's
right?
funny that the Islamic countries that these people come from quite often want to kill them as well.
It's almost like we've absorbed the scum of the world.
Well, that's what many Muslim countries say about the Muslims that come to our country. And this isn't what I'm saying, but you talk to people about the migrant crisis or mass immigration, and they say, oh, it's great for us because you take all the people we don't want.
Yeah, we take the criminal classes.
From countries that are, by the way, no one in Britain would want to live in the first place, so why would you want them as your neighbour, the lowest people in the society?
Yeah, but can you guess who represented why?
Was it Keir Starmer?
Yep. Operating under cab rank rule, he successfully argued at the Court of Appeal that the deportation should be reconsidered to ensure Y was eligible for an amnesty under a peace process to end Algeria's civil war. Otherwise, a return to his home country might breach his human rights. One of Starmer's other early terrorism cases was representing Al-Qaeda terrorist Khalid al-Fawaz, who was fighting his extradition from Britain to the US in 2000 for conspiring with Osama bin Laden to bomb American embassies. Starmer also represented Fawaz under the cab rank rule, and it's just amazing how he always seemed to have time free in his diary for all of these terrorists who would come to him. That's incredible. The kind of terrorism cases Starmer fought led to a political backlash about human rights. Tony Blair said that should legal objections rise to the deportation of terrorist suspects, Labour would rewrite the Human Rights Act if necessary. So he was too radical even for Blair.
That's quite something, isn't it? Because Blair in the Labour Party is seen as the right wing of the party, and Starmer was seen to be cut from that ilk, but he's actually hidden just how radical he is. But with his track record, you can see that, actually a lot of people in the Labour Party might be like, hang on a minute, this guy's pretty extreme.
Yeah, even for Labour, this guy is pretty insane. He just had a better image management than Jeremy Corbyn, who he was being presented as way to the right of when he assumed as leader of the Labour Party. Then you can go to this case from 2003, which is a very important case, which I can read about from this article, this paper from the Henry Jackson Society from a few years ago, where they were talking about the prospective immigration policy of Sir Keir Starmer's Labour Party. And it speaks about in here, in 2003, 6 asylum seekers took the government to court, and Starmer legally represented 5 of them. The case rested on whether the Home Office, but led by Lord David Blunkett, could refuse to support asylum seekers who did not claim asylum as soon as they arrived in the country. I don't think we should be supporting them at all, but that's just my opinion.
Agreed.
The claimants won the case with Starmer's representation, and the case decided that asylum seekers must be supported, regardless of how soon after their arrival their asylum case is made. So just get into the country, 5 years later, you've been living here illegally, shouldn't be here in the first place. Oh, I'd like some benefits now. Make your case. There you go, sorted. Blunkett remained adamant in his position and announced his intention to fight the case in the Court of Appeal. He said shortly after the ruling that, frankly, I'm personally fed up with having to deal with a situation where Parliament debates issues and the judges then overturn them. We were aware of the circumstances, we did mean what we said, and on behalf of the British people, we're going to implement it. So that's a good point that's being made there, right? So our elected representatives are the MPs in the House of Parliament. Their entire job is to debate this kind of legislation and make these decisions on behalf of the British people, who they are, again, representing. They make these decisions, and then random human rights lawyers come and say, no, you can't do that, actually. Nobody's elected them. Nobody wants them. But they get to make these sweeping changes to how British society is managed, including making sure that terrorist suspects are out on your streets, in your communities. And that is all thanks to Keir Starmer, who wrote the textbook on how to do it. And I'm not actually done there, because there's one other little bit of this document which is very, very interesting. Which is, during this period, because obviously you've got the cab rank rule, right? So he had to represent those. He just had to represent those terrorists because he had the space free in his diary. What a coincidence! But during this period, Starmer also represented many cases abroad, of which a significant portion concerned the rights of those claiming refugee status. One overseas case involved representing Hizb ut-Tahrir at the ECHR. I'll call them HT. HT gained notoriety as a radical international organisation accused of supporting terrorism and anti-Semitism. In 2008, Starmer led a team which made an application to the ECHR arguing for the German ban on HT to be overturned on human rights grounds. So he was leading that team, and they point out, Importantly, this case may have qualified as foreign work since the dispute itself related to Germany and the ECHR is based in Strasbourg. Under a foreign work exception to the cab rank rule, Starmer would not have been bound to represent HT and would have had every right to refuse the case. But he didn't. So there you go.
Thanks for watching, folks. If you'd like to support us, and we'd really appreciate it if you did, go over to lotus.com, sign up for only £5 a month, and watch Bo's incredibly detailed series on the life of Julius Caesar. In this one, part 10, he's discussing what happens when Caesar goes to Britain. Like I said, part 10. This is how deep we end up getting into these subjects. And of course, go over to X, formerly Twitter, and follow us at lotuseaters_com.